Everyone laughed when this young woman dared to buy a ruined house for pennies. The neighbors thought she was crazy, and her own family insisted she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But one day she invited them inside, and they turned pale when they saw what was hidden behind those walls. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. Mia had always believed that a real home was not just a place with walls and a roof, but a foundation where one could rebuild a life, even if everything else had fallen apart. Yet, until recently, this belief had been more of a distant dream than a tangible goal. Her reality had been a rented room in a noisy city, the hum of traffic as her lullaby, and the bleak fluorescent lights of a fast food job greeting her every dawn. She had tried once to carve out something of her own by opening a small coffee stand with borrowed money, fueled by hope and sleepless nights. That dream collapsed under bills, competition, and the bitter words of the man she once loved, who left her with debt and a final remark that echoed in her head even now. "You're not someone who succeeds. You only try." Those words accompanied her everywhere like a shadow. They sat beside her on buses, whispered to her each time she looked at a bank statement, and haunted her even on the days she dared to smile. She left the city not because she wanted to run, but because staying any longer meant letting those words define her. She needed distance, silence, and a chance at something new. That chance came in an unusual form, a listing online for a house in a small town she had never heard of. The price was unbelievably low, almost suspiciously so. A few grainy photos showed a drooping porch, peeling paint, and shattered windows. Most people would have closed the page and moved on. Mia didn't. For the first time in months, something inside her stirred again, a small spark that felt like possibility. She withdrew the last of her savings, signed the paperwork that made her the legal owner of a forgotten property, and packed what little she still had into her old car. The road to the town felt like a journey through her own fears, each mile further away from everything familiar, everything safe. She rehearsed optimistic thoughts in her head, promising herself that this could be the beginning of a life she deserved. Still, beneath those positive words lived a quiet, tremulous worry. What if the house really was just a pile of broken wood? What if everyone was right about her? When she pulled up to the property, the late afternoon sun rested low behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the structure seem even older, even more defeated than the pictures had suggested. The house stood at the edge of the town, half hidden behind tall, unkempt grass and rustling weeds. The porch roof sagged like an exhausted old man ready to collapse after decades of holding on. Several windows were boarded up, others broken entirely. The paint had once been white, perhaps cheerful, but now it wore the murky brown of neglect and rot. Still, Mia stepped out of her car, leaving the engine running, just in case fear convinced her to flee. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she walked up the path, if it could even be called a path anymore. She paused near the porch steps and looked up. The house looked back, silent and wounded. Some would have seen only ruin. She saw a soul bruised by time and abandonment, yet undeniably standing. She unlocked the door, though it hardly mattered. One push would have opened it just the same. The odor was the first thing that hit her. The stench of moisture, mold, old wood, and years of closed windows. Dust motes floated in the air like ghosts disturbed by an intruder. Cobwebs hung thick across corners, and decaying furniture sat exactly where it had been left, frozen as if waiting for life to return to the rooms. Newspapers from another decade blanketed the floor, wilted by time and dampness. A nervous laugh slipped from her lips, the kind that comes when fear and disbelief collide. She hugged her arms close to her chest as though protecting herself from the cold draft, and the disappointment curling its fingers around her ribs. But she forced her legs to move further in, exploring the space she now owned. A fallen painting frame lay against the wall, empty. A chair rested on 3 legs. The kitchen sink hung lopsided, and the cabinets had been gnawed by mice. She kept moving. The walls creaked with every step. Beneath her feet, the wooden floor groaned, warning her that too much weight might be a danger. She found what looked like an old newspaper clipping pinned to a corkboard, a headline speaking of an elderly man who had once lived here alone, refusing help, shutting out the world before his quiet death. People in town whispered that he had gone mad, that he had feared thieves breaking in to steal imaginary treasures. Outside, she heard a brief noise, voices, the neighbors. A group had gathered near their fence, watching her with expressions that said everything they didn't dare speak aloud. Why would such a young woman waste money on a house like this? What was wrong with her? Did she think she could fix what nature and time had destroyed? As she peered through the cracked window, she saw one woman nudge another with her elbow, both stifling laughter. A man shook his head and muttered something she couldn't hear, but she knew the tone. It was pity wrapped in amusement, the kind given to someone who tries but will surely fail. Heat rushed to her face, part shame, part anger. She closed the curtains, what remained of them, and leaned against the wall. It was solid beneath her back despite its age and imperfections. She pressed her palm against it, closing her eyes. "This is mine," she whispered, but only in her head, so no one could mock the sound of hope. The sun was beginning to fade, and with night came an unsettling silence. She turned on the flashlight from her phone and searched for a place to lay her sleeping bag. For now, this would be her home. Cold, broken, and dark, but still a home. As she lay there that first night, wrapped tightly to keep the chill away, familiar doubts reached up through the floorboards and took hold of her thoughts. Was she foolish? Everyone seemed to think so. Even her own mind whispered that she had made a mistake too big to undo. She stared at the cracked ceiling, tracing the jagged lines like maps of unknown worlds. A tear slid quietly down her temple, but she wiped it before it could reach her chin. Defeat wanted to claim her early. She would not let it. If she surrendered after only one night, then every cruel word spoken to her would be right. Every dream would turn to dust. Perhaps the house was testing her, asking if she truly belonged here. And if she wanted it badly enough, she would have to fight for it. That thought gave her something to cling to as the air turned colder and the walls moaned against the wind. Even the loneliness pressing heavily on her chest could not suffocate the smallest ember within her. Tomorrow, she told herself, would be different. Tomorrow she would start from the ground up, piece by piece. Because if this broken house could be given a second chance, then maybe she could too. Still, the fears lingered. There was no one here to help her or guide her. She had only herself and what strength she had left. Yet in that isolation lay the truth that frightened her the most and encouraged her the deepest. If she succeeded, it would be because she built her success with her own hands. And if she failed, there would be no one else to blame. She adjusted her position, pulling the sleeping bag closer, listening to the unsettling stillness. Somewhere above her, she thought she heard soft scuttering, perhaps mice living in the attic. She shivered, imagining unseen creatures crawling through unseen pathways in the dark. But she told herself that even those tiny intruders were just part of the challenge. This house had layers of abandonment, secrets tucked away in corners, memories trapped beneath dust. She wondered what stories the walls held, what the old man had hidden, what he had feared. She wondered whether the house was waiting for someone who cared enough to bring it back to life. Her breathing slowly steadied. Exhaustion finally began to outweigh anxiety. Before sleep took her, she allowed one final hope to settle within her, that someday those who looked upon this place and saw only ruin would be forced to see something different: beauty, worth, resilience. And they would know they had been wrong about the house, wrong about her. Tonight, though, no one in the world knew that a silent transformation had begun. No one but Mia and the broken walls around her, which, despite their age and damage, still stood firm, refusing to fall. The house had survived so much already. She liked to think that meant she could too. As she drifted into sleep, the darkness surrounding her no longer felt completely empty. It felt like a beginning. Morning arrived without warning, slipping into the room through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Mia awoke stiff and cold, the thin sleeping bag doing little to shield her from the chill that rose through the rotten floorboards. The ache in her back and the numbness in her fingers were immediate reminders that comfort was a luxury she no longer possessed. She pushed herself upright slowly, blinking at the dusty streaks of sunlight as they painted shapes on the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten years, but she inhaled it with a strange sense of determination. This was her air now, her walls, her life. She stepped outside to fetch tools from her car, and as soon as she crossed the threshold, she felt eyes on her. Sure enough, across the street, a man in a worn cap leaned against his truck, sipping coffee as if watching a spectacle put on for his entertainment. Farther down, two older women stood at their mailbox, longer than necessary, whispering behind cupped hands. Mia pretended not to notice. She carried the first armload of supplies into the house, feeling the weight of judgment following her into every shadow. The work began with the simplest task imaginable: clearing the debris. What was simple in theory became a Herculean effort in practice. Each piece of garbage seemed to fight against being removed, as though the house was clinging to its decay. She filled trash bag after trash bag with rusty cans, broken glass, damp newspapers that dissolved in her hands, and remnants of lives long since abandoned. Her clothes quickly became covered in grime. Sweat mixed with dust until she looked like she had crawled out of the very earth beneath the house. By noon, she had only managed to clear a small section of the living room floor. She sank onto a large wooden crate she'd dragged outside earlier, breathing heavily as the sun warmed her face. Her arms shook from overuse. Her palms burned and blistered. She stared back at the house and tried to see progress, but it looked just as broken as before. The laughter of passing teenagers floated toward her, not loud, but sharp enough to pierce the fragile hope she was trying to build. One of them commented loudly about how long they thought she would last. Mia dropped her head, letting her hair curtain her expression so no one could see the frustration forming behind her eyes. Inside the house again, she focused on the kitchen next. The cabinets were sticky with years of neglect and layered grime. She scrubbed until her arms protested, scraping off what she could, discovering beneath all the filth a wood grain that might one day shine. Again and again, she reminded herself to look for potential, not ruin. But potential required strength, patience, and money. Qualities she feared she was quickly draining. Later, when she tried to fix a loose floorboard near the hallway, she found the wood crumbling beneath her hammer. She had to stop, sit back, and fight rising panic. How much of this place could really be saved? The walls themselves seemed to suck the warmth from her bones. She pulled her coat tighter and steadied her breathing. This was not defeat. This was reality. Reality could be changed. Each night she fell into the sleeping bag exhausted, muscles screaming for rest. Her dreams were strange, shifting images of collapsing ceilings and endless piles of rubbish. Sometimes she woke abruptly, certain she had heard footsteps or whispers from rooms she had not yet dared to fully explore. The silence here was alive, and she was still learning how to live with it. With what little money she had, Mia bought cleaning solutions, cheap tools, and second-hand protective gear from the local hardware store. The cashier eyed her with curiosity, the kind that felt too close to condescension. She could almost hear the unspoken thoughts, "What is someone like you doing with a place like that? Why bother? It's hopeless." She paid without offering a word, carrying her supplies like a shield. Some tasks gave her small victories. The moment she scrubbed away the darkest stains on the wall near the hallway corner, she revealed a part of the original wallpaper decorated with faded floral patterns. It hinted at a time when someone once cherished this place enough to give it beauty. That discovery lit something inside her. If beauty had existed here once, then it could exist again. She refused to let time be the only voice that told the story of this house. Despite progress, discouragement continued to lurk close by. On the 5th day of work, she climbed a ladder to remove a dangling piece of broken ceiling. With a sharp crack, the plaster above gave way too suddenly, raining dust over her as she toppled onto the floor. She lay there for several seconds, dazed, staring up at the exposed wooden beams overhead. Some of the beams looked more fragile than she wanted to admit. Tears stung her eyes, not from pain, though her elbow throbbed, but from the crushing weight of realizing how endless this struggle seemed. Her own family didn't make it easier. When she sent photos of her progress, hoping for encouragement, she received messages warning her she was making a huge mistake. They insisted she should cut her losses and come back home. Her mother reminded her how badly things went the last time she took a leap without thinking, urging her not to ruin her future again. The disappointment embedded in every word cut deeper than any blister or bruise. But Mia refused to answer immediately. She needed to believe in something, even if she was the only one who did. In rare moments of quiet triumph, she would pause, hands on hips, breath heavy, and look at the room she had just cleaned. She let herself feel pride, not arrogance, but validation. She was doing what she had set out to do. It was slow and grueling, but it was real. Each board hammered into place, each sweeping motion of a broom, each patched crack in the wall was a step forward. She didn't need applause. Progress itself was a reason to keep going. Nights grew colder. She placed cardboard over the largest holes in the walls to keep the wind from slipping through. She huddled beneath her worn blanket, listening to the groans of the old house settling into the night, like a weary companion sighing in its sleep. Sometimes she whispered into the darkness, telling the house that she wasn't going anywhere. Maybe she was talking to herself as much as to the structure around her. As days blended into weeks, her body adapted. Calluses toughened her palms where blisters once burst. The sight of her reflection, dusty, smudged, hair tied back and clothes worn, didn't bother her anymore. This look meant she was working, rebuilding, surviving. She learned how to remove rotting floorboards and nail in new support beams after watching countless tutorials online. She began to understand which sounds of the house meant danger and which simply meant age. One afternoon, while she worked outside clearing tangled weeds from the yard, the man from across the street approached her. He didn't offer help or introduce himself. He only leaned casually against her fence and remarked that the house wasn't worth saving. He spoke as if his opinion were a universal truth. Mia kept working, though her throat tightened and her eyes burned. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how his words struck her. He returned to his truck after delivering his prophecy of failure, leaving dust swirling in his wake. She didn't cry until later, when the sun dipped and the yard turned gold beneath the quiet sky. She sat on the step that led to the porch, clutching her knees to her chest. The world felt too heavy then, pressing down on her with the memory of every doubt ever spoken aloud. But even through the tears, a stubborn flame burned bright inside her. If they all thought the house wasn't worth saving, then proving them wrong mattered more than ever. Meditation came in the rhythm of work. Pull, lift, scrub, hammer, breathe. The house slowly responded to her efforts, like a patient awakening after years of sleep. Cobwebs vanished from corners, light reclaimed space that had once belonged to shadows, and the smell of fresh wood repair began to push out the stale scent of ruin. Yet loneliness clung to her persistently. She missed hearing laughter that wasn't mocking, missed the comfort of someone saying they were proud of her. Some evenings, she would stop and just stand in the empty living room, gazing around at walls still scarred by time. In that silence, she often wondered if she was building a home or simply rearranging a gravestone of someone else's forgotten life. Still, she pressed on. Giving up would mean accepting what everyone believed about her, that she was incapable, unrealistic, destined to fail. And she refused to be the person they expected her to be. Every day, she woke up and proved herself wrong about her own doubts. The house, in its own stubborn way, did the same. She learned how to find victory in the smallest changes. The first repaired staircase step that didn't creak beneath her, the corner of the dining room floor that no longer dipped dangerously, or the patch of yard that looked like grass might one day grow again. These were glimpses of the future she envisioned, one where warmth, pride, and belonging lived here. The road ahead was still daunting. The hardest corners of the house were yet untouched, like the mysterious, dark attic and the damp basement she had avoided with every excuse available. But she would get there, one battle at a time. By the time the moon replaced the sun once more and she crawled into the sleeping bag on that cold living room floor, Mia was exhausted. But her exhaustion was different now. It felt earned, deserved. She looked up at the cracked ceiling again, but no longer saw a threat. She saw challenge. She saw possibility. She saw the reflection of a woman who wasn't quitting. Tomorrow, she decided she would take on the attic. It terrified her, but progress always required stepping into darkness. And maybe, hidden among the dust and remnants of the past, something waited to remind her she had been right not to surrender. Days passed like a slow tide, each one bringing incremental progress, yet reminding Mia constantly of how vast the work ahead remained. But she had made a promise to herself. The attic would be next. It hovered over her like an unspoken challenge. Every night, when she lay beneath the ceiling that creaked and whispered, she felt the attic's presence, silent, dark, and waiting. So on a morning when courage seemed stronger than fear, she stood below the narrow pull-down ladder, staring up at the rectangular hatch as if staring into the unknown. The ladder groaned in protest when she tugged the handle, releasing a wave of dust that danced chaotically through the air. With each rung she climbed, the scent of stagnant time grew thicker. The flashlight shook in her grip, and her heart thudded a tempo that echoed in her ears. She emerged into the low, cramped space beneath the roof, careful not to step on any questionable boards that might crumble beneath her weight. A small circular window near the far end allowed a single ray of light to pierce through, illuminating particles that floated like ash. The place was freezing, though outside the sun was warm. Boxes, rotted, sagging, and half collapsed, lined the space in chaotic piles. There were old trunks covered with so much dust that they resembled forgotten tombs. A broken chair leaned against a support beam, its legs eaten by insects. Torn bags of insulation spilled from the walls like exposed wounds. Mia's skin prickled as she crawled deeper inside, her flashlight scanning for any sign of danger, mice, spiders, or a section of floor ready to collapse. She opened the first box she encountered. Inside lay stacks of yellowed magazines and postcards, all musty and chewed along the edges. Useless. Another box held nothing but rusted nails spilling out like a metallic spill. She pushed it aside, coughing as dust rose in a suffocating cloud. Her hands were soon gray from dirt and neglect. Still, she pressed forward, refusing to let discomfort push her backward down the ladder. Near the center of the attic, a wall of old wooden crates towered, bizarrely intact. They looked too deliberate in placement. Neat, symmetrical, almost intentionally structured. Something about them stood out from the rest of the chaos. Mia moved them aside, one heavy crate at a time, grunting with effort as the attic floor creaked ominously under shifting weight. After she removed the last crate, she froze. Behind them, there was a small partition in the wall, boarded shut, but not part of the original attic architecture. Someone had nailed planks over a recess, sealing off whatever lay inside. The wood covering this section didn't look as aged as the rest of the attic. The nails were newer, the boards less brittle. Someone clearly wanted this space hidden. Her pulse quickened. With shaking hands, she drove the back of a hammer beneath the first board. It resisted, as though warning her to leave this alone, but she yanked harder. The nail squealed before releasing with a metallic pop. One by one, she pried them off, her breath growing heavier. The sound echoed in the confined space, filling her with a mix of dread and curiosity. When the last board fell away, a narrow cavity appeared behind it. In the dim beam of the flashlight, she noticed several cylindrical shapes, rolled canvases bundled together and tied with brittle old twine. An old leather satchel lay beside them, flattened and dusty like a relic unearthed from the past. For a moment, Mia simply stared, not trusting her eyes. The find felt cinematic, unreal. Why would anyone hide a collection of canvases in an attic like contraband? Heart hammering, she reached into the space and retrieved one of the rolls. The fabric felt fragile, stiff with age. She carried it towards the beam of light and slowly unrolled the canvas. A cloud of dust puffed out as the painting revealed itself, colors muted by time but unmistakable in their vibrancy. The figure in the portrait was abstract, yet emotionally striking. Brush strokes were layered with intention, the composition detailed and haunting. It was nothing like children's drawings or amateur sketches. This was art. Someone had cared deeply about every inch of it. Without realizing, Mia's breath caught. She unrolled another, then another, each one different. Some were haunting landscapes, a lonely tree on the edge of a cliff, a desolate coastline framed by storm clouds. Others were portraits of figures whose eyes seemed to hold entire stories of grief and longing. Though the edges of the canvases were frayed and mold had bitten into a few corners, the work itself remained undeniably powerful. Her flashlight slipped slightly in her hand as she noticed a faded signature in the bottom corner of one of the paintings. It read, R. Clark. She said the name aloud, testing it like a secret code. It didn't ring a bell, but the emotion in the painted scenes told her that the artist had been someone who poured their soul into their work. Mia set the canvases aside carefully and reached for the leather satchel. Inside was a stack of old papers. Some were envelopes containing letters, the ink faded and handwriting elegant but rushed. On several envelopes she recognized the same name, Richard Clark, alongside return addresses of art galleries or studios in major cities. It seemed he had once been a part of something bigger than this small town. There were also newspaper clippings tucked neatly into a folder. One article described a modest exhibit attended by few, praising Clark's talent but lamenting his obscurity. Another mentioned that he had abruptly withdrawn from public life years later, refusing commissions and declining invitations. After that, silence. Mia sat back, overwhelmed. Her discovery did not feel like trash. It felt like a legacy sealed away and forgotten. But why? Had he hidden them himself to protect them? Had he feared someone would take them? Or had he simply wanted the world to leave him in peace? The attic suddenly felt heavier, as if filled not only with dust but also the weight of someone's abandoned dreams. She gathered the letters, the clippings, the canvases, careful not to damage them further, then made her way back down the ladder. Once in the living room, she spread everything across a cleared area on the floor. Sunlight from the window fell across the paintings, illuminating a depth of color she hadn't noticed in the attic's gloom. Despite being cracked and wrinkled by time, they seemed to breathe in the light. She traced the signature with a gentle fingertip. In her life, luck had rarely shown itself. Every step forward had been battled for, scraped from the ground. Yet here, in the wreckage of a house she owned by sheer stubbornness and desperation, she found something that made her heart race with cautious excitement. Was this finally a turning point? Or was she grasping at another illusion? That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep. She sat with the paintings like a silent guardian, afraid something might happen to them if she dared to close her eyes. Her curiosity surged stronger than exhaustion. She felt compelled to find answers. Using her phone, she searched for information about Richard Clark. When the signal was strong enough to cooperate, she uncovered fragments of a story. A gifted but misunderstood artist whose work had never been given the attention it deserved while he lived. In recent years, a renewed interest in lost talents had brought his name back into conversation within the art world. Collectors were beginning to explore his limited-known pieces. Mia's hands trembled as she scrolled through auction results showing the astonishing prices of a few authenticated Clark paintings. Her mind spun as she tried to process the implications. She could pay off her debts, restore the house, maybe even start her life exactly as she had once imagined. But along with excitement came something else: responsibility. These paintings, these memories, these remnants of a life silenced by time, they were not hers by right simply because she stumbled upon them. They belonged to history, to culture, to anyone who recognized the heart that had been poured onto them. She looked around at the cracked walls, the patched windows, and her sleeping bag lying in the corner. She knew she could not protect the paintings properly in their current condition. She needed help. She needed someone who could confirm what she already suspected and tell her what to do next. The local museum wasn't far. She had passed the small brick building during one of her rare errands in town. The curator there, she recalled from a brief glance at the website, specialized in regional art history. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would take one painting, just one, and ask for answers. As the first hint of sunrise crept into the sky, she finally allowed herself to rest. The paintings around her seemed to glow softly in the shifting light, no longer buried in darkness. She curled up next to them like a child guarding treasure. Her eyelids grew heavy. For the first time since she walked into this ruined place, her dreams were not filled with collapsing floors or mocking voices. Instead, she dreamed of colors, brushstrokes, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this house was not a punishment for her mistakes. It might be her redemption. Morning arrived with a fragile calm, the kind that settles in when the mind is too full to form a single clear thought. Mia woke on the floor of the living room, her body stiff from the cold, but her heart beating with a strange rhythm, part fear, part anticipation. The canvases lay beside her, carefully arranged and protected by an old bedsheet she had found in one of the closets. Each one seemed to watch her as she rose to her feet, as though silently asking what decision she would make today. She approached the stack and selected the portrait with the clearest signature of R. Clark, brushing away another thin layer of dust that had settled overnight. She held the painting close to her chest on the drive to the museum, her gaze flicking between the road and the canvas as if afraid it might vanish. The car heater coughed out bursts of lukewarm air that barely warmed her numb fingers. Her mind raced faster than the passing trees. Every mile brought her closer to the moment where her discovery would either be confirmed as something extraordinary or exposed as a mistaken hope. When she pulled into the parking lot of the small, brick-walled museum, she sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel. Her palms were damp. She remembered every cruel word anyone had ever spoken about her attempts to rise above her circumstances. The fear of being wrong again, of looking foolish in front of experts, rose like a tidal wave threatening to pull her under. But she swallowed the doubt and stepped out of the car, clutching the painting like the last fragile piece of her courage. The museum doors opened with a soft electronic chime, welcoming her into a quiet space filled with framed photographs and sculptures from local artists. The air smelled of old books and polished wood. A receptionist looked up from her desk, offering a polite smile that wavered when she noticed the dusty painting Mia carried. With a nervous voice, Mia asked to speak with the curator. The receptionist disappeared through a doorway, leaving her standing alone under the scrutiny of artworks that seemed far more confident in their worth than she felt in her own. When the curator arrived, he was a man in his late 50s with kind but discerning eyes. His professional attire suggested attention to detail. Mia introduced herself and carefully explained how she had discovered a collection of paintings in her recently purchased home. She watched as he examined the portrait, his face shifting through subtle expressions, surprise, curiosity, disbelief, and finally a level of seriousness that tightened the air between them. He asked if she knew what she might be holding. She shook her head slowly, barely daring to breathe. He motioned her into a back room filled with bright inspection lamps and magnifying tools. Under the intense lights, every crack in the paint and every precise stroke seemed to come alive. The curator spoke softly, reverently, as he explained that he had seen Richard Clark's signature only a few times in his career, mostly in photographs of his work, rarely in person. Clark's early exhibitions had been small and tragically overshadowed by larger names. His life had been marked by disappointment, isolation, and a growing frustration with the art world that failed to understand him. Though he died nearly invisible to society, a movement in recent years to rediscover unrecognized talents had pushed collectors and critics to search for his lost pieces. Mia listened as though caught in a dream. Every word from the curator was a revelation, each sentence confirming the worth she had dared to hope for. When he finally looked up from the painting, his eyes shone with a mixture of astonishment and respect. These works, he said, if authenticated properly and restored, could be immensely valuable. The scarcity of Clark's surviving pieces alone would draw significant attention. For a long moment, Mia couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt slightly, and she reached out to steady herself on the edge of the table. He noticed her trembling and reassured her that this was a discovery any museum would consider monumental. He asked if she had more paintings, and she admitted quietly that she did. Several. His excitement grew, and he explained the process of formal authentication, the careful steps needed to confirm the artwork's lineage. It would take some time, but he promised to personally arrange the examinations and to put her in contact with restoration experts who could preserve the fragile canvases. Mia left with a small stack of documents and a sense of weightless disbelief. She drove home, stunned, clutching the knowledge that her life had just become something entirely different from what it had been a week ago. Every mile closer to the house felt like a step into a future she hadn't been allowed to imagine before. Back inside the living room, she spread the museum papers next to the paintings and sank to her knees, overwhelmed. She reread the curator's words in her mind. Cultural significance, rise in market demand, a rare and important find. She felt pride bloom in her chest, but it was mixed with something deeper, a feeling of connection to the artist whose legacy had been forgotten in silence. The thought of selling everything fast and escaping her struggles flickered through her mind more than once. But no matter how alluring the imagined comfort of quick wealth, something inside her resisted the idea. She looked up at the crumbling ceiling, remembering how the attic had felt when she found the canvases, cold, abandoned, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Richard Clark's art had been left to decay, buried under dust like a secret not meant to be entirely lost. The loneliness in his work mirrored the loneliness she had carried from the city to this town. She saw a kindred spirit in his brushstrokes, a person who had tried, failed, and tried again until hope cracked. If she sold everything, his legacy would scatter into the hands of collectors who might hide his work in private halls away from the world. That wasn't what he deserved. And she wasn't someone who simply stumbled on treasure for her own gain. She needed to protect his story as much as her own dream. With renewed resolve, she decided she would sell only a few paintings, just enough to afford repairs, authentication, and restoration. The rest would stay here and build something lasting. That decision became the turning point. Soon after, she returned the selected paintings to the museum for evaluation, handling them with the care of priceless artifacts. Restoration experts arrived at the house days later, their equipment making the living room feel like a temporary laboratory. They praised her for preserving the work so well despite their neglect. Each restored canvas would emerge brighter, stronger, more deserving of the attention it never received in its creator's lifetime. The neighbors began to notice the visitors coming in and out, the careful transport of canvases wrapped like precious relics. Whispers swirled faster than the dust she swept daily from the doorways. People who once watched her with amusement now stared with veiled curiosity and growing envy. One woman, who had laughed loudly when Mia first arrived, approached her at the grocery store pretending friendliness, asking intrusive questions about what Mia had found in the house. Mia simply smiled politely and offered no explanations. her family reacted differently. When she called to share the news, her mother's voice wavered between awe and disbelief, followed quickly by relief that her daughter might finally be on stable ground. They congratulated her, as though her success had been inevitable. They spoke as if they had always believed in her, glossing over the pleas to give up and the warnings that she was ruining her life. Mia listened quietly, understanding the sudden shift in tone for what it was. Faith offered only after success wasn't faith at all. With the funds she received from the sale of the first authenticated painting, she hired a team to begin major renovations on the house. Not the cheapest workers, not corner-cut in material. She wanted the structure to be secure and worthy of the art it would eventually hold. She watched as new beams replaced old, weakened supports, as fresh wiring brought light into rooms that had spent years in darkness, as windows were rebuilt to hold sunlight once again. Every improvement felt like breathing life into something that had nearly died. But even as the house grew stronger, the road ahead stretched dauntingly long. Bureaucratic paperwork for art ownership and heritage protection piled up on her kitchen table. Decisions had to be made about climate control, safety systems, formal gallery registration, and insurance, all overwhelming responsibilities she had never before considered. At night, she lay awake worrying that one wrong choice would unravel everything. Yet she found courage in the work. She found purpose in the restoration. She found strength in honoring the man whose paintings had survived years of neglect, just as she had survived years of doubt. Step by step, the house was returning to life, its transformation no longer invisible. When she walked through the room, she could begin to imagine what they might soon become. White walls adorned with Clark's art. Visitors from across the region stepping carefully across polished floors. Voices softened with awe instead of mockery. A place where history, beauty, and perseverance existed side by side. And every time she paused to admire a newly painted wall or a restored window frame, she whispered a silent promise to the house and to herself. She would not let this chance slip away. She had been underestimated for too long, laughed at, dismissed, told to settle for less than she dreamed. Now, with each canvas carefully preserved and each crack filled with care, she became the architect of her own redemption. People would soon discover that what looked worthless on the outside often concealed something priceless within. They would learn this house was worth saving. They would learn she was too. And when the day came for the world to finally stand inside these walls and see the art that once lay ignored in the attic, they would understand how wrong they had been to doubt either of them. The first real morning of hope arrived quietly, disguised as nothing more than sunlight slipping gently across the newly repaired kitchen floor. Mia stood barefoot on the cool boards, a cup of coffee warming her hands, and for the first time since she purchased the house, she allowed herself to simply breathe. The air still held some musty remnants of the past, but the scent of fresh timber and drying paint slowly replaced them. Change was no longer theoretical. It was happening. It was visible in every corner she looked, every room she stepped into. The structure that once barely stood was now being resurrected by her efforts and the hands of workers she could finally afford to hire. Over the past weeks, workers hammered, sawed, measured, and rebuilt, restoring strength to the bones of the house that had seemed beyond salvation. A new roof no longer allowed rain to seep in and destroy what remained of the past. Walls were stripped to the studs and redressed in clean panels. The yard, once a jungle of weeds, was cut back into something resembling an open space with potential. At night, Soft light glowed through windows that once were covered in boards and fear. The house was beginning to stand tall again, but restoration did not come without challenges. The more that was uncovered, the more needed to be fixed. Beneath the floorboards, some joists were almost hollowed out by years of termites. Pipes crumbled at a single touch, rusted through like brittle bones. Every new problem brought new expenses, and each time an unexpected cost threatened her plans, Mia felt that familiar panic twist in her chest. She clung to the careful budget she made after selling the first painting, but numbers on a page felt fragile compared to the weight of reality. She watched the balance in her bank account shrink faster than she wanted to admit. There were nights she sat hunched over the dining room table, a temporary surface resting on two sawhorses, running numbers again and again, wondering if she had made a mistake by refusing to sell more paintings. She could be comfortable, wealthy even, if she sold just 2 or 3 more canvases. Freedom from all struggle was within her grasp, and yet every time that temptation arose, she closed her eyes and pictured a gallery filled with Richard Clark's life's work, preserved together, finally seen. That image was worth more than money. It kept her from making decisions she knew she would regret. If the financial strain wasn't enough, the attention she received now came with its own burdens. Neighbors who had once mocked her now pretended they had always supported her. They lingered at the fence with friendly smiles, offering thinly disguised attempts to learn inside information. Mia recognized the shift immediately. Their curiosity stemmed not from kindness, but from sudden awareness that the strange young woman who moved into the ruins possessed something valuable. She greeted them politely, but she never let the conversations last long. Gossip was a currency as dangerous as any debt, especially in a small town that craved stories. Strangers also began appearing, some under the guise of admiration, others openly probing for the possibility of buying the land or helping her handle the artwork. One afternoon, a neatly dressed man knocked on her door, claiming to be a distant relative of Richard Clark. He spoke confidently, as though he expected the house to be handed to him at his request. His eyes scanned every detail inside, lingering too long on the wrapped canvases awaiting restoration. He insisted that Clark's art was rightfully his family's property. Mia stood her ground, explaining calmly that she was the legal owner of the house and everything inside it. The tension in the room sharpened, and he left with the cold promise that lawyers would soon be in touch. That night, anxiety consumed her. What if there was some forgotten clause, some hidden legal claim that could remove everything she'd worked for? The fear of losing it all was suffocating. She slept poorly, waking at every creak, half expecting someone to break in and take what she guarded so fiercely. In the days that followed, she contacted a lawyer recommended by the museum, who reassured her that her ownership was secure. Still, the experience reminded her how fragile success could be when others decided they wanted a piece of it. Even as the house transformed inch by inch, the emotional toll of the renovation wore on her. There were days she wished she could share the weight with someone else. Not the opportunistic smiles of neighbors, nor the carefully disguised hunger of strangers, but a true companion, a voice reminding her she wasn't alone. Some evenings she caught herself staring at her phone, thinking of calling her mother or an old friend from the city, someone who knew her before the house became her world. But pride sealed her silence. She wanted to show the finished home, the final victory, not the messy stages where doubt still crept in like shadows along unfinished walls. Still, not every moment brought fear or loneliness. There were long intervals of genuine joy, the kind that springs from creation. She painted the bedroom walls herself, rolling soft colors across surfaces once blackened by age. She planted wildflowers along the front walkway, imagining how they would bloom in the spring, welcoming guests with bursts of color. She cleaned and polished old floorboards that, despite years of neglect, shone with stubborn resilience. Every improvement reminded her of the day she first crossed the threshold and dared to believe this place could be hers. And as she restored these walls, she realized she was restoring more than a house. She was rebuilding the foundation of who she was meant to become. The art restoration progressed alongside the home's transformation. Each time she visited the museum, she watched another painting surface from under layers of grime, colors brightening, details sharpening. Richard Clark's talent was undeniable, a haunting elegance captured in oil and canvas. With each restored piece, the excitement among art historians grew. Gallery directors in nearby cities started sending inquiries. Journalists reached out to the museum asking about the elusive woman who had resurrected a forgotten artist. Mia read early articles with a mix of pride and disbelief. They called her the steward of a historic discovery, the savior of a legacy. No one used the words failure or foolish anymore. She wondered what Clark would think if he could see how his work was now admired. Would he be proud? Would he be relieved that someone finally saw him? Or would he be saddened that recognition arrived only after death? Mia felt a quiet responsibility, not just to protect his paintings, but to honor him as a person whose story deserved to be told properly. Slowly, the vision in her mind became clear. The house would not only be a home or even just a gallery, it would become a shrine to persistence and overlooked talent. It would stand as a reminder that greatness doesn't always bloom in the sunlight of admiration. Sometimes it grows in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. She planned meticulously. The main floor would become exhibition space, with climate-controlled rooms to preserve the paintings. The former bedrooms upstairs would transform into archives and storage. The attic would remain a place she never forgot, a memorial to discovery. The yard would host outdoor events, lectures, and gatherings celebrating art and resilience. She imagined children staring wide-eyed at the colors Clark left behind, artists finding hope in his late recognition, and neighbors who once laughed entering quietly, reverently, humbled by their own misjudgment. There were setbacks, of course. A city inspector delayed progress over minor code issues, forcing more paperwork and costs. A rumor spread that the house would soon be torn down, causing tourists to drive by and photograph it like a doomed relic. Some even knocked on her door, begging for a tour before it all disappeared. Mia politely turned them away. Let them wait. Patience would be rewarded with something much greater than gossip. During one long afternoon of painting trim in the hallway, she paused to look at her hands, dry, rough, marked with tiny scars. They were not the hands of someone who gave up easily. They were the hands of someone who had chosen a harder path, one that demanded everything yet offered the chance to rewrite the narrative of her life. She smiled quietly and kept working. The biggest transformation, she realized, was happening within her. She no longer felt like a woman running from a broken dream. She was building something extraordinary. She no longer believed the voices that once told her she would fail. She had pushed through every doubt, every insult, every challenge the house had thrown at her, and she was still here, still fighting, still creating. Every floor she reinforced, every lot she installed, every brick she restored whispered the same message. She was not that girl who left the city in defeat. She was someone different now, someone whole. As summer faded toward autumn, the house near the edge of town stood taller than before. Strong, warm, welcoming. Still unfinished, yes, but undeniably alive. The transformation was nearing its final stages, and soon all the world would be invited to witness what she and Clark had made together across time. One evening, Mia stepped outside and looked at the house as twilight deepened around it. Soft lights glowed from the windows, illuminating fresh paint and restored wood. Fireflies gathered near the garden bed she had planted. For the first time since the day she arrived, she saw not a project, not a burden, but a future, a beautiful one. She felt her heart swell, no longer heavy with fear, but full of anticipation. There was still work ahead, bureaucratic approvals to secure, final restorations to finish, plans to finalize. But the hardest part, believing in herself, was no longer a battle she fought. She had won it. Soon, this house would open its doors not as a ruin mocked by neighbors, but as a gallery where the past and future met, where art breathed again, where her own story would hang silently beside Clark's. She turned to go inside, pausing for one last look. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree by the porch like a whisper of encouragement. The house did not seem haunted anymore. It seemed grateful, and in the deep quiet of that moment, Mia understood something she had never dared to believe before. The house wasn't just becoming a new life. It was giving her one too. The final weeks before the grand opening passed in a blur of movement, decisions, and long, breathless nights. The freshly restored house hummed with life as people came and went. Electricians making final adjustments, art handlers carefully placing each painting under perfect lighting, and Mia, who moved through the rooms with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every inch of progress. What had once been a hollow ruin now stood as an elegant space filled with intention and quiet pride. The smell of plaster and sawdust had finally faded, replaced with the clean scent of new paint and polished wood. Sunlight entered freely now, illuminating the walls with the rich tones of Clark's resurrected art, turning each canvas into a beacon of color and emotion. Mia walked slowly through the main gallery room, her palm brushing the smooth finish of a restored frame. The painting showed a woman standing alone on a shoreline, her posture defiant against a storm that gathered behind her. The museum's experts had praised this particular piece as one of Clark's most powerful works, a portrait of resilience against overwhelming odds. Every time Mia looked at it, she felt as if it were reflecting her own journey back at her. She paused in front of another piece, an abstract splash of deep crimson and midnight blue. Its initial chaos resolved into hidden order, as though Clark had embedded a secret message that only the patient could see. Mia smiled softly, knowing she was one of the few to understand the language of persistence he had spoken through his brush. The night before the opening, she barely slept. She sat at the dining table, sipping lukewarm tea, gaze drifting from her invitations to the flicker of porch lights outside. She thought of every step that had brought her to this moment, every blister, every tear, every voice that had told her she would fail. She remembered standing in this very room when it still smelled of rot and disappointment, convincing herself that beauty could bloom here again. Tomorrow, the world would see what she saw. Her heart fluttered nervously, excitement and fear intertwining like vines around her ribs until breathing itself felt like a risk. Morning arrived with a soft golden glow, and Mia dressed in a simple but elegant black suit, her hair pinned neatly away from her face. She studied her reflection in the small mirror near the front door. It was not the same person who had arrived months ago, frightened, unsure, determined yet fragile. This woman appeared grounded, as though she had grown roots deep inside these restored floorboards. She took a slow breath and stepped outside just as the first visitors began to gather at the gate. Cars lined the street, filling the quiet neighborhood with a hum of anticipation. People adjusted their jackets, cameras slung around their necks, murmuring about the remarkable story they had read in newspapers. A local television crew set up equipment near the porch. Reporters chatted excitedly, flipping through notepads. The same neighbors who once watched her with mocking amusement now approached with wide smiles and words of admiration. Mia accepted their greetings politely, though she couldn't forget how quickly opinions had shifted. It didn't matter now. Time had a way of revealing truth more loudly than any voice. When she finally opened the doors, the crowd flowed into the house like a tide drawn toward light. Gasps arose almost simultaneously as the gallery revealed itself in full. Flawless white walls, perfectly mounted frames, and Clark's masterpieces commanding every gaze. People moved slowly through the rooms as if entering a sacred place. Conversations softened into reverent whispers. Some paused longer at certain canvases, brows furrowing, eyes glistening as emotions stirred unexpectedly. Others leaned closer to small plaques that told fragments of the artist's life, his struggles, his solitude, his genius overlooked. The museum curator, dressed in a crisp suit, approached Mia with a proud expression. He congratulated her warmly and introduced her to several critics and art historians who had traveled to witness this unveiling. Each shook her hand with genuine appreciation, expressing admiration not only for the discovery, but for her vision in preserving the works together. She accepted their words gracefully, though inside she felt overwhelmed. Never before had she been surrounded by so many people who spoke to her with respect rather than doubt. As she guided guests from room to room, she overheard snippets of conversations. People commented on how astonishing it was that such a legacy had been hidden for so long in a house that everyone had dismissed as worthless. Others speculated on the emotional depth of Clark's later pieces, imagining the silent battles he must have endured in this very home. Mia's heart swelled each time someone recognized the beauty that had been buried in dust for years. The man, who once leaned smugly against his truck across the street, now approached with a cautious smile, his posture apologetic. He tried to offer compliments, praising the transformation and the importance of clinging to hope. She nodded kindly, not to dismiss him, but because she no longer needed validation from those who once mocked her. His presence, once oppressive, now meant nothing more than proof of how far she had risen. The distant relative who had appeared demanding the painting's returned also attended the opening, though his confidence had clearly deflated. Flanked by his lawyer, he kept his head low, no longer able to deny the legitimacy of Mia's ownership or the integrity of her determination. He must have realized how absurd it looked to try to steal a legacy he had never cared for. Mia did not offer him anger or satisfaction. She simply acknowledged his presence with a neutral nod before turning to greet someone who genuinely wished her well. Victory through dignity felt more powerful than any argument. Children walked through the gallery, pointing at their favorite pieces, asking questions with bright curiosity. Mia knelt down to their level and explained in simple words who Richard Clark was and why his art mattered. She could see future artists sparkling in a few young eyes, dreaming perhaps that their own work, too, could one day be seen and valued. She felt warmth in her chest, knowing that she was part of planting that hope. As the afternoon sun shifted higher, Mia slipped away from the crowd for a moment, stepping out onto the wraparound porch. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the town she had grown to know through its whispers and judgments, now silent, humbled. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, carrying laughter and soft applause from inside the house. The voices blended into music that seemed to come from the walls themselves, celebrating rebirth. She closed her eyes and listened just for a moment. She imagined Richard Clark standing beside her, quiet and watchful, much like the shadows she once feared in the attic. She wondered if he would be proud of what she had done, not just rescuing his paintings from decay, but rescuing his memory from erasure. His soul, once trapped in silence, now spoke loudly through every awestruck gasp inside. Mia whispered a silent thank you into the wind, feeling the presence of history responding with gratitude. Later in the evening, after the last visitors had drifted away and only a few team members remained to pack up equipment, Mia wandered through the gallery one final time. Every painting seemed to glow with a soft radiance, as if acknowledging that they were finally home. She walked slowly, letting her fingertips hover just beside each frame, tracing the air around their edges. She felt a deep peace, profound and grounding, settling into her bones. Her journey wasn't only about uncovering forgotten art, it was about uncovering herself. The house had challenged her, forced her to face doubt, fear, and exhaustion until she learned what resilience truly looked like. It had taught her that worth is not determined by first impressions or the judgments of others. It grows from the persistence to keep going even when the world expects you to fail. The house had been dismissed just as she once was, broken, useless, a remnant of something that once tried but fell short. But she had seen potential where others saw shame. She had loved possibility more than comfort, and in doing so, she restored not only a building and an artist's legacy, but her own sense of identity. As she reached the final painting near the entrance, sunlight dipped low, casting gold across the floor. The room shimmered. She realized she was standing in a masterpiece, not one hung on a wall, but one built through sweat, tears, and unshakable belief. The house itself had become art. She turned off the lights, letting the evening settle softly around her. Closing the door behind her, she felt no fear of the darkness, only the calm of knowing that everything she needed now lived within these walls and within herself. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new visitors, new chapters, but tonight she could finally rest with the certainty that she had changed her destiny. The neighbors might still whisper, the world might still watch, but every time someone stepped through that door, they would witness the truth. Here was a home reborn from ruin. Here was a legacy rescued from silence. Here was a woman who refused to stay broken. And as Mia descended the steps of the porch, the cool evening wrapping her in gentle embrace, one final thought drifted through her mind, anchored firmly in triumph. What once was forgotten had now been remembered, and no one would ever laugh at this place or at her again. Don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Check out our other stories right now, and share this video with someone who loves a good twist.